Hi, this is Mr. Gideon. So now that we've talked about how to graph a picture of an entire economy, and that's a little different illustration of the big picture than the circular flow. We've also talked about what aggregate supply and aggregate demand are, what are also the factors that can shift those curves left and right. It becomes obvious that an economy is not always going to be in long-run equilibrium. It's not always going to be at its true potential, regardless of whatever the numbers are that are associated with those potential points that it can be at. If you look at countries around the globe, you can obviously make the argument based on their resources and other factors that they have different natural levels of employment and unemployment, natural levels of output, and so forth. But if you're looking at an individual economy and it has a recessionary gap or an inflationary gap, it begs the question, should we do anything about it? Or what comes next? This is really where we start to get into opposing views, theoretically, of government's role and how an economy adjusts over time. So it's most appropriate to start with the classical theorists. They represent essentially the more hands-off approach, and they originated back with the Austrian school in the 1800s, and they're symbolized by Friedrich von Hayek, who was kind of a disciple of the Austrian school and then later made a name for himself across the globe, but was based in the United States. And in a more modern sense, Milton Friedman. These are not the only people that are classical theorists, of course. They, as well as many other people, have won Nobel Prizes that are well known for representing classical theory. Milton Friedman, who passed away a couple of years ago as of this recording, it's summer of 2011 right now, like Friedrich von Hayek, represent the classical school of economists that were based primarily in Chicago school. Harvard typically represents the other side of the aisle, Keynesian philosophy, which we're going to get into later. But classical theory, in essence, says that the economy is self-regulating, and so the government should generally stay out of trying to manage the economy. Classical economists believe that most, if not all, markets are competitive, and that prices and wages will adjust quickly to any surpluses or shortages, and equilibrium will be quickly reestablished. That's kind of their starting viewpoint in a nutshell. So what happens if the economy is in an inflationary gap? If you'll recall, an inflationary gap is when an economy is beyond its potential. So unemployment at that point is less than the natural level of unemployment, and there's a shortage in the labor market. So gradually, when you have this situation, nominal wages will rise and SRAS will shift to the left, bringing the economy back to long-run equilibrium. When you have an inflationary gap, the economy is producing it at this higher than potential area, but it can't last. It's like saying, if Barry Bonds, this is my bias, of course, Barry Bonds is on steroids, then he can produce much more than he could have without being on steroids. You can disagree with this. There's two viewpoints of it. But assuming that in fact happened, it's not sustainable. It can't last forever. It's the same thing with an economy. If it's operating at beyond its true potential, it's only possible that it can be in this inflationary gap because nominal wages haven't yet fully adjusted upward. Because jobs are abundant and workers are scarce, nominal wages will eventually rise over time, as well as other sticky prices, which we've talked about. And so gradually this SRAS will shift to the left. Let's take a look at that and how it should look if you're going to graph a picture of that phenomenon for me. So once again, I think it's good for you to practice these things, pick up your stylus and follow along. And in this case, I've already typed U.S. economy. You would handwrite it. And if you'll recall, price level goes at the top of this axis. When we're talking about individual markets, then we just put price. If we can be more specific, we will. If it was the money market, we'd put nominal interest rate because that's the type of price in that market. If we were talking about the global funds market, we would put real interest rate because that's the specific name of that kind of price. But of course, Once again, if we're talking about an entire economy, we're talking about one of the indexes. So we refer to that as price level. You'll recall that CPI is one of the ways to measure that. The PPI, the GDP deflator, and so forth. And of course, down here we have the quantity of real GDP, and our potential in this kind of model is represented by long-run aggregate supply. But if we said we're in an inflationary gap, where do we find ourselves right now? Well, it's where the remaining two curves intersect. And in this case, for an inflationary gap, they intersect to the right of long-run aggregate supply. So this curve, of course, that's downward sloping from left to right is aggregate demand. For all of these curves, we put sub 1 because that's just the way that I want you to be in the habit of doing it. Sometimes you'll see materials where the starting point is not labeled sub 1. There's no notation like that, and then whenever there's a movement, the next curve, the redrawn curve, if you will be will have the sub 1 notation. This is just something that I feel comfortable with, and so this is the way that I'm training you. And so for short run aggregate supply, that will also have sub 1. So there's an inflationary gap. Now our potential below the RAS, of course, is the potential for output. So it's the quantity, our natural quantity of output, where we would be, of real GDP. It's also our natural level of income, the place where you can find full employment, and the natural rate of unemployment. But that's not where this economy is, of course. In this economy, right now, it's there. That's where our current level of output is. And this is where our current price level is. Now, I'm not going to take the time to write all of those long definitions for these labels off to the right or down below the graph, but I'm saying them again, and I'm taking that time to make sure that you hear them once again, and you know that all of those things need to appear in your legend. Be in the habit, when you're doing a graph, of trying to put as much as you possibly can on the perimeter of the graph, because especially as things start to move and change, the interior of the graph here becomes really cluttered. Use your abbreviations, and for these kinds of abbreviations, push them to the outside along these axes so that anything that you have to mark on the interior of the graph is clearly visible. But don't forget to have a legend for all of these things every time you use an abbreviation. Use the abbreviation. So going back to what we said just a minute ago, if you're in an inflationary gap, and we're assuming, according to classical theory, that wages and prices are flexible, they will adjust at some point, then the economy will fix itself. The way that the economy fixes itself is on the supply curve, right there. And so how does that happen? Well, as I just said a minute ago, as nominal wages eventually increase, then RAS is going to shift to the left, because as workers start to demand more pay, and they get it, then suppliers don't have as much in the way of resources to put into other parts of their operation. Their labor costs increase, and so they have to cut back on their supply. And so this is what happens if wages and prices are flexible. This is the contribution that classical theorists have given us. And that's how it would look if you were going to graph it for me. Now, what happens if the economy is in a recessionary gap? Well, obviously the opposite. If you're in a recessionary gap, the unemployment rate is higher than the natural unemployment level. There is a surplus in the labor market, and eventually nominal wages will fall, RAS will shift to the right, and in this case, economy will once again move to long-run equilibrium. It's because workers are abundant and jobs are scarce in this situation. Eventually, nominal wages, along with other sticky prices, will fall, shifting RAS gradually to the right. So if we show this example in reverse, you have price level once again on the left, CPI, PPI, real GDP, deflator, Who knows? Here's where our potential is. But now, this economy is currently to the left of that. According to classical theory, if wages and prices are flexible, they're not completely stuck. Gradually over time, adjustments are going to be made, and now the economy fixes itself. Once again, when the economy fixes itself, it's the supply curve we're talking about shifting, and in this case, it will shift right. When you're drawing these graphs, make sure that you're showing movement in 3 different ways with 3 different arrows. Didn't leave myself quite enough room here, so that was my mistake, but I'm just going to try to squeeze in Q sub 2 at the bottom. And that's a picture of the U.S. economy fixing itself from a recession or recessionary gap to long-run equilibrium. Once again, use the labels, push as much as you can to the exterior of the graph, and then off to the side or down below, have a legend, and I know it's tedious, but define all of the shorthand that you show there. Here's a simplified version of what I just showed you, whether it was adjusting from an inflationary gap or adjusting from a recessionary gap. In the first case over here to the left, just follow the points in order. Let's say for a while there we had an economy that was in long-run equilibrium, and some factor caused aggregate demand to shift to the right. An inflationary gap is what we have for a while until the economy fixes itself, and we get to point 3 with higher prices. In this situation, we start with point 1, and let's say AD shifts to the left. The economy once again can fix itself according to classical theory if wages and prices are flexible, and Saras shifts down to the right. We end up having lower prices, but getting back to our long-run equilibrium. So what are the implications of this? What does this all mean? It means, and you may have heard this phrase before, that if the economy is self-regulating, then it would follow that we would have a laissez-faire policy, a public policy, a government policy of not interfering with market activities in the economy, having the government stay out of things because the economy can fix itself. Some economists believe the government doesn't have a management role to play at all. At least the most pure of the classical theorists would believe that. And so to recap, not only does this theory at its core apply to the people that we label as classical theorists, but also some of these labels that we'll get into later, new classical and monetarist theorists, they all fit in the classical camp or under the umbrella of classical theory. It started way back in Austria and then made its way to the United States, notably with Hayek, but also some other major theorists.